Close your eyes for a second and imagine spending over €1 billion on 3 players, assembling the most expensive front line in football history, and still failing to win the one trophy that matters most. Now imagine doing it again, and again, and again. This is the story of how Luis Enrique's PSG didn't just break European football, they shattered it into 1,000,000 pieces, proving that money can't buy everything, but it can definitely destroy the beautiful game. But here's what'll absolutely blow your mind. PSG's project wasn't just about winning trophies. It was about sportswashing, about buying legitimacy, about turning a football club into a political weapon. We're talking about a team that spent more money in 5 years than most countries' entire GDP, yet somehow managed to become the biggest laughingstock in European football. I've spent weeks analyzing how PSG's obscene spending spree changed football forever, studying the transfers, the tactics, and the systematic destruction of competitive balance that followed. What I discovered will show you exactly how one club's desperate pursuit of glory broke every rule in football and left the sport worse off than they found it. So buckle up, because this is the story of how unlimited money became football's biggest curse. It all started in 2011 when Qatar Sports Investments bought PSG for a relatively modest €70 million. But this wasn't just a business investment. This was the beginning of a geopolitical project that would use football as a tool for international influence.
Nous étions les premiers à vous donner l'information dès ce midi. Le PSG est vendu à des investisseurs du Qatar.
Within months, PSG's spending went from reasonable to ridiculous to absolutely insane. They signed players like they were collecting Pokemon cards, throwing around transfer fees that made other clubs look like they were shopping at a charity shop. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came in 2017. PSG paid €222 million for Neymar, $222 million for one player. To put that in perspective, that was more than most clubs had spent in their entire history. But PSG weren't finished. Just days later, they signed Kylian Mbappé for another €180 million. When PSG signed Neymar and Mbappé in the same window, they didn't just break the transfer market, said a football economist. They obliterated it. Suddenly, every decent player was worth $50 million, every good player was worth $100 million, and every great player was priceless. But here's where it gets really crazy. PSG didn't just break the transfer market, they broke financial fair play. UEFA's rules were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of spending, but PSG found loopholes, used creative accounting, and basically gave the middle finger to financial regulations. They inflated sponsorship deals with Qatari companies, created fake revenue streams, and manipulated their books in ways that would make Enron jealous. When UEFA tried to punish them, PSG's lawyers fought back with the fury of 1,000 suns, threatening legal action and political consequences. PSG showed that financial fair play was toothless, said a sports lawyer. They proved that if you have enough money and enough lawyers, you can basically ignore any rule you don't like. The impact on European football was immediate and devastating. Transfer fees exploded across the continent. Players who were worth $20 million suddenly cost $60 million. Clubs that had been carefully managing their finances were forced to either spend recklessly or get left behind. Barcelona, desperate to replace Neymar, spent $140 million on Philippe Coutinho and another $120 million on Antoine Griezmann. Real Madrid responded by breaking their own transfer record multiple times. Even traditionally sensible clubs like Liverpool and Manchester City were forced to spend hundreds of millions just to stay competitive. PSG created an arms race, said a club executive. Every club in Europe was forced to choose between financial responsibility and competitive relevance. Most chose to spend money they didn't have rather than fall behind. But the real damage wasn't just financial, it was cultural. Football had always been about more than money, but PSG turned it into a pure capitalist exercise. Players became commodities, clubs became brands, and fans became customers. The beautiful game was becoming the expensive game, and PSG were leading the charge. When Luis Enrique arrived at PSG in 2023, he inherited this monster that Qatar had created. Team with unlimited resources but no soul, world-class players but no chemistry, and massive expectations but no patience. Enrique, who had won the treble with Barcelona, was supposed to be the tactical genius who could finally make PSG's expensive puzzle pieces fit together. He was tasked with turning a collection of superstars into an actual team. But here's the problem. PSG's squad wasn't built for football, it was built for marketing. They had 3 players who all wanted to be the main character, a midfield that looked great on paper but couldn't defend, and a defense that was more concerned with Instagram followers than clean sheets. Managing PSG is like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician thinks they're the soloist, said a former PSG coach. You have incredible individual talent, but getting them to play as a team is almost impossible. Enrique tried to implement his high-pressing, possession-based system, but it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. PSG's superstars weren't used to pressing, weren't used to tracking back, and weren't used to putting the team before their individual statistics. The results were predictably chaotic. PSG would dominate Ligue 1 matches against inferior opposition, then fall apart against quality teams in the Champions League. They looked unstoppable one week and completely clueless the next. PSG's problem isn't tactical, said a football analyst. It's psychological. When you spend that much money on players, they start to believe they're bigger than the team, bigger than the coach, bigger than the club itself. But PSG's impact on European football went far beyond their own performances. They had fundamentally changed how the sport operated, and not for the better. Smaller clubs were being priced out of the market entirely. Players who used to cost $5 million were now $25 million. Young talents who used to develop at mid-level clubs were being hoarded by super clubs and loaned out endlessly. The gap between rich and poor clubs became a chasm. Leagues became less competitive as the same few clubs dominated every season. Fans started to lose interest as the outcomes became predictable. PSG didn't just break the transfer market, said a football historian. They broke the competitive balance that made football interesting. When only 5 or 6 clubs can afford the best players, the sport becomes boring. If you're shocked by how one club's greed managed to destroy the competitive balance of European football, make sure to subscribe to Soccer Chronicles because we expose the truth behind football's biggest problems. Trust me, PSG's impact on the sport gets even worse from here. The Champions League became PSG's white whale. Despite spending over €1 billion, despite assembling the most expensive squad in history, despite hiring world-class coaches, they couldn't win Europe's biggest prize. Their failures became legendary. The 6-1 defeat to Barcelona in 2017, the collapse against Manchester United in 2019, the final defeat to Bayern Munich in 2020. Each failure more embarrassing than the last, each defeat proving that money couldn't buy the one thing PSG desperately wanted. PSG's Champions League failures became a meme, said a football journalist. They were the ultimate example of how not to build a football team. All the money in the world, but no heart, no character, no winning mentality. But here's what made PSG's failures even more damaging. They inspired other clubs to make the same mistakes. Manchester City, Newcastle United, and other state-owned clubs started following the PSG playbook, spending ridiculous amounts of money and distorting the market even further. The Premier League became a playground for billionaires and sovereign wealth funds. La Liga struggled to compete with the Premier League's TV money. Serie A and the Bundesliga fell further behind. European football became a two-tier system with the super-rich clubs at the top and everyone else fighting for scraps. PSG opened Pandora's box, said a UEFA official. They showed that if you have enough money, you can ignore the rules, distort the market, and basically buy your way to success. Other clubs took note and followed suit. The impact on young players was particularly devastating. Instead of developing at clubs where they could get regular playing time, talented youngsters were being stockpiled by superclubs and loaned out repeatedly. Players like Kylian Mbappe became prisoners of their own success, trapped at clubs that paid them fortunes but couldn't offer them the sporting challenges they craved. The transfer market became a game of musical chairs, where only the richest clubs could afford to play. PSG created a system where money mattered more than merit, said a youth development expert. Young players stopped dreaming about playing for their local clubs and started dreaming about getting rich at super clubs. It changed the entire culture of football. But perhaps PSG's most damaging legacy was how they normalized financial doping. What had once been considered cheating became standard practice. Creative accounting, inflated sponsorship deals, and regulatory capture became the norm rather than the exception. UEFA's financial fair play regulations became a joke. Clubs learned to game the system, hire better lawyers, and find new loopholes. The idea that clubs should live within their means became quaint and old-fashioned. PSG proved that regulations are meaningless if you have enough money and political influence, said a sports economist. They showed other clubs that the rules don't apply if you're willing to fight hard enough and spend enough on legal fees. The human cost of PSG's project was enormous. Traditional clubs with deep roots in their communities were priced out of relevance. Fans who had supported their teams for generations watched helplessly as their clubs became irrelevant. Players became mercenaries, moving from club to club based purely on financial considerations. The connection between players and fans, clubs and communities was severed in favor of global brands and marketing opportunities. PSG turned football into a business first and a sport second, said a fan group representative. They showed that if you have enough money, you can buy anything, except the respect of real football fans. The tactical impact was equally damaging. Instead of developing innovative playing styles or nurturing young talent, clubs started believing they could solve every problem by spending more money. Coaching became less important than recruitment. Youth development became less important than buying established stars. Long-term planning became less important than immediate results. PSG's approach infected the entire sport, said a former coach. Clubs stopped believing in their own ability to develop players and started believing that success could only be bought. It was a cancer that spread throughout European football. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of PSG's story is how it could have been different. With their resources, they could have built something beautiful. They could have invested in youth development, supported grassroots football, and used their platform to grow the sport. Instead, they chose the easy path. They bought success rather than earning it, prioritized marketing over merit, and treated football like a commodity rather than a culture. PSG had the opportunity to be a force for good in football, said a former FIFA official. They could have shown how to use wealth responsibly, how to invest in the future of the sport. Instead, they chose to be a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited money. The irony is that despite all their spending, despite all their star players, despite all their marketing campaigns, PSG never achieved their ultimate goal. They never won the Champions League during their peak years, never gained the respect they desperately craved, and never became the global powerhouse they dreamed of being. Their legacy isn't one of success, it's one of excess. They didn't break European football by winning everything. They broke it by showing that money without wisdom, resources without responsibility, and ambition without authenticity can destroy the very thing you're trying to achieve. Today, European football is still dealing with the consequences of PSG's actions. Transfer fees remain inflated, financial fair play remains toothless, and the gap between rich and poor clubs continues to grow. Young fans grow up in a world where football success is measured purely in transfer fees and wages rather than trophies and achievements. The romance of the underdog story becomes increasingly rare as the same few clubs dominate every competition. PSG's legacy is that they made football less interesting, said a football writer. They proved that with enough money, you can buy almost anything, except the magic that makes football beautiful. But there's hope. Fans are starting to reject the commercialization of football. Clubs are beginning to focus more on sustainable development. Regulators are slowly learning how to close the loopholes that PSG exploited. The beautiful game is fighting back against the forces that PSG unleashed. It's a slow process, but football has survived worse crises and emerged stronger. Football is bigger than any one club, no matter how much money they have, said a football historian. PSG may have broken European football temporarily, but the sport will heal, adapt, and find a way to be beautiful again. So the next time you see a ridiculous transfer fee, or watch a super club stockpile players they don't need, or witness the growing gap between rich and poor clubs, remember PSG's story. Remember how one club's unlimited ambition and unlimited resources nearly destroyed the sport we all love. If this story of greed, excess, and the corruption of football's soul opened your eyes to what's really happening in the beautiful game, make sure you're subscribed to Soccer Chronicles, because we're not afraid to tell the uncomfortable truths about modern football. Hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the forces shaping the sport we love. Trust me, there are so many more stories about football's dark side waiting to be told. Because sometimes the biggest threat to football doesn't come from bad referees or poor performances. It comes from the people who claim to love the sport but are actually destroying it from within. And nobody embodies that threat better than PSG's billion-euro experiment that broke European football forever.